Deborah Small.
Do I have to stand up?
You don't have to stand up. Make yourself comfortable. We can bring a chair up to the front, too.
Yeah, that's all right.
You can wander around. You can stand
The
on your
sun
head,
is
whatever
good.
you want to do.
So I'm not so much of a rabble-rouser, per se. But I did want to respond to some of the comments that I've been hearing in and around the community and kind of why we're here. I actually think that our perception about what's happening is a little off. I think the fact that we're getting seriously attacked by the feds and that there's been an uptick in enforcement of marijuana is actually a sign that we're winning. I think it's a sign, it's like the last gasp of a dying empire. And I would just, because my thing is history. I like to study history. I like to read a lot. I like to watch a lot of documentaries. And the thing that's true, if you actually look, particularly in American history, is that every time we've reached a critical point that we're about to make a major change, there's been a heavy-handed backlash. So a lot of people forget that just before we had the Civil War, you had the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, which actually upped the ante on slavery, because up until that point, people in the North could be an observer of the system, and they could decry it and talk about how terrible it was and how morally bankrupt the South was. But up until the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, they never had to participate. But once that law was passed, it actually required them to now become participants in a system that they detested. So they couldn't just observe slavery. They now had to help catch slaves and return them to their owner. And it's not an accident that it wasn't that long after that law was passed and enforced that you actually had the outbreak of hostilities, because you brought things to a boiling point. The same was true with alcohol prohibition. A lot of people forget that in the last few years, just before prohibition was repealed, New York State, which was the state that had most rejected prohibition, actually passed mandatory minimum laws, the first ever, that was specifically about alcohol. And it was like the last gasp of the dry people to try to enforce a system that they had already lost. Similarly, I recall that it wasn't that I was still in law school when the Supreme Court passed issued an opinion upholding Texas's sodomy laws and saying that they had a right to be able to prosecute people for adult consensual sexual behavior. Well, a lot of us thought that that was such a step backwards, and we couldn't believe that the court would make a ruling like this in as recent as the late 80s. But it was almost the last gasp of what they saw on the horizon was a change in perspective. So here we now have, 2 decades later, a complete sea change in public attitudes. So I actually believe that in spite of what we're looking at right now, that California, Colorado, Montana have actually been leading the way for the country. And that because of what's been happening here, national attitudes about drugs have changed, and national attitudes about marijuana has changed. And the fact that 53% of Americans believe that it should be legal should say something to us about where the country is, in spite of the fact that we're witnessing a harsher federal crackdown on this. I think that in the same way that the right and the Republicans keep trying to use issues around civil marriage as a wedge issue to preserve their base, the right is also trying to use issues around the drug war as a wedge issue to try to preserve the last bastion of support that they have for this war that, quite frankly, the public doesn't support anymore. But I also think that we need to be thinking ahead and not just looking at how do we respond to and react to the kind of persecution that we get from the federal government and law enforcement, but actually beginning to put in place what is the type of post-prohibition world that we want to see. I think events like this provide an opening for it, but I'm not sure that it actually takes into account the full scope of what the public is looking for, of what most of us would want in a world that was existing without prohibition. I think we've made a lot of progress with respect to cannabis, but I think that there's a lot more progress for us to make. I think it's important for us to not allow the movement for social justice that helps support this movement to get devolved into yet another scheme that's about making money that ends up feeding into the hands of the corporatists.
Hear, hear.
Because I also
Hear, hear.
think that part of what's going on, separate from being a last gasp of the drug warriors, that this is also an attempt to squash this level of the cannabis industry and clear a path for the corporatist. Because if the government recognizes the inevitability of legal marijuana, then they have to ask themselves, whose hands do they want it to be in? Who do they want it to be controlling it? They don't want it in our hands. They don't want it in the hands of people who see it as an avenue for raising people's consciousness about the ways in which our society is screwing them over. And they definitely don't want it to be in the hands of people who will use the money to help support movements that are about undermining broader government policies, including the policy in support of drug prohibition. So for them, if they can squash this community, this business community, and create more barriers to entry in the form of zoning laws, more regulation, more et cetera, then the only people who are able to enter are the corporatists, who will make money, but who won't use the money against the government in the same way. They'll just use the money to keep buying the government, which is what they've been doing all along.
Deborah Small, everybody. I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's hear it for Deborah Small. First of all, these are very powerful, very insightful, very strong words. She's correct. The suits are coming for the hippies, and cats got to figure out how you're either going to work together or you're going to keep them out. But and to her point, I just want to remind people, stick together, okay? Stick together. Stop fighting each other over bullshit. You understand where I'm coming from? Some little petty little thing, right? We're all here to free weed. You understand where I'm coming from? We're all here for cannabis legalization. Let's work together toward that. Let's not get caught up in the little he did this or he did that or I can't work with that guy. You can work with this guy. It's a big-ass bus. We can all work together. Okay, I'm sorry to get on my little soapbox. Wait, I got to make one more quick announcement because there's a workshop starting, and then you can keep talking. I'm going to let you finish. See, it's going to get funny. Watch, 8 or 9 more times. At 2:30 over at the Deep Green Conference Rooms, we have 2 wonderful discussions going on. One is the legalization equation, charting the path forward in room A. Patrick Goggin will be the moderator. Stephen D'Angelo, Bill Panzer, Dan Rush, and David Long will be the featured speakers. And then in room B, organic, high-yield agriculture. That's some of 4 of my favorite words right there. With Christopher Doherty and Ian Davidson, will be in room B. And those are going to start at 2:30 if you want to see those. And now, ladies and gentlemen, back to Deborah Small, everybody. Deborah Small.
I just want to leave people with 2 thoughts, and then I'm happy to turn the mic over. So the first thought is that I think it's important for people to recognize the role that cannabis plays in the global drug war. Most people don't recognize outside of the U.S., and even, in fact, in the U.S., that the war on drugs is, in fact, really a war on cannabis. And I was saying in the workshop that I was just in that in many ways the inclusion of cannabis into the schedule of controlled drugs was like a gift to the prohibitionists, because there's never been enough substance abuse related to opiates and stimulants to justify the huge apparatus that's been put together to support the war on drugs. So cannabis is actually a really important element. In the U.S., it accounts for half of all drug arrests, but quite frankly, on a global level, it does too. I was at a meeting a few years ago with the head of the UN Global Drug Control Agency, and he gave a speech where he pointed out that on the global level, 80% of all illicit drug use in the world is about cannabis. So if you take cannabis out of the equation, there are not enough drug abusers in the world to justify the war on drugs. So it's really important for them to keep cannabis in the mix. And that's why the fact that public opinion is changing on this is important. The second thing that I want to leave people with is the international dimension of what's going on, because I also think that the upping the ante by the feds is directly related to what's going on in Latin America. The fact that Mexico, Bolivia, Argentina,
Peru,
Venezuela, all of
Don't
these
even
countries.
forget Portugal. Let's throw Portugal in the mix,
They
too.
have all rejected the drug war, and they not only are rejecting it, but they're actually, Bolivia is the first country to pull out of the UN drug conventions.
Let's hear it for Bolivia.
But I don't believe that they'll be the last. And
Right.
the drug war depends on the cooperation of all of these international governments.
Right.
Well, the Latin Americans have said, we're not bleeding for you anymore. We've given up enough of our people, enough of our blood, enough of our treasure
Enough of
to
our
fight a
resources.
war that cannot be won, particularly when the U.S. is doing very little to address the problem of the demand for drugs, which is fueled in part by the rising inequality in our country that we pretend is not happening.
I have a concept for a moment, and I'm sorry to interrupt. Okay, Jose, I'm not really sorry to interrupt, but I'm following the convention. That's what you say when you interrupt. You say, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. That marks us as civilized. From what I've read and from what I understand, really, drug abuse percentages are very small, and they stay constant. It's about 3, 4, 5%. I don't remember the exact number. 5% of people in any population will have a drug abuse problem, legal, non-legal, whatever. Those are just the people that will have the problem. So is it, like you said, I think that just underscores your point. It's not really a big deal. Once you start treating it like a social health issue and not a criminal issue, everybody will be smoother and ahead of the game.
But the reason that you have to maintain prohibition is because it allows you to pretend that the state has no responsibility for the fact that people can't find jobs, don't have decent housing, aren't getting a good education. So in every country that you go to in the world where you find who were the people who were being arrested for drugs, they're always the marginalized community, the minority groups, whether they're racial, ethnic, or religious minorities. They are the people who are outside because of their sexual orientation or their religious beliefs or whatever. So the war on drugs, in effect, is a very convenient smokescreen that states like to use
For
in
private
order
prisons?
Well, you know, no one else incarcerates the way that we do. So we're unique in that respect.
Let me, just on a metaphysical question, should a prison ever be a for-profit entity? Should that even enter? How do people come up with that concept? We can make money from sending people to prison.
In a world in which our very blood and water has been privatized, why should we be surprised that prisons are privatized?
Oh, I'm not surprised.
I'm just saying. That's the capitalist way.
A friend of mine said to me the other day, she said, people always surprise me, and yet people never surprise me.
I mean, you know, it's funny because I think, again, that example is a perfect example of how the right has been able to shift the conversation. Because 25 years ago, the idea of private prisons was considered anathema and rejected by everyone. Now they proliferate all over the country. Why? Because they had persistence and preparation. And as my son always says...
But should you ever have a financial incentive to put someone in jail? I'm sorry to interrupt your son's
Our country was built on the financial incentive of enslaving people. So why would private prisons be any different?
Powerful.
I mean, really. I mean, the financial incentive of either using their labor or stealing their land. Mm-hmm. So we're on land that was stolen from people who used to be here before.
So you're saying the cycle continues?
Absolutely.
Huh.
And if it's not manifest destiny or some other concept that you use, now it's the war on drugs and protecting kids. So this is the thing. For me, where it changes is in the shifting of consciousness. And the last thing that I wanted to say is that marijuana is an important agent for helping people to change their consciousness. To me, it's not an accident that the war on drugs was not just targeted at racial minorities, it was also targeted at young people who were challenging the corporate philosophy that their goal in life was to be a cog for the system. And it was important to be able to target people and to quash that way of thinking. But we've reached a new place where the Occupy movement is actually challenging conventional thinking and conventional consciousness. Our role should not be to make marijuana reform the #1 issue for the Occupy people or for anyone else who's concerned with social justice. But what we should want is to see the issue of ending prohibition be included in the broader struggle for social justice, and an understanding that access to all substances, including currently illicit drugs, are part of the pathway to our spiritual and psychological liberation from the slavery of corporate capitalism.
Deborah Small, well, do you have a website or a book? Like, where can people find you? Can I follow you on Twitter?
So
can we
thank
be Facebook
you. I
friends?
actually
What can
wanted
we do? Can I just live at your
to
house
announce
for a while?
that our organization is organizing a People's Movement Assembly on the drug war in June. And we're planning to do an all-day event looking at how we can begin to envision what a post-prohibition world looks like. For more information...
I'm going to open a bud and breakfast.
Hey, I'm there, especially if you serve banana bread.
You know we do.
But for more information, you can either email me at Deborah, DEBORAH, at breakchains.org, or visit our website, which is www.newdrugpolicy.com.
Newdrugpolicy.com and DEBORAH at breakchains.org.
Thank you.
Deborah Small, everybody. Chris Conrad, Deborah Small, Paul Stanford, Clint Werner. Clint Werner. Damn you, short-term memory loss. Are there any questions so far? Any of these? Okay. Well, thank you guys. Do you guys have any closing things you want to say, or are y'all talked out? I know Clint always has something. Clint's got a big mouth. So it makes him.
I just want to say, if there's anybody out there who has free time at the end of the week, this week coming up, there's an amazing conference in Tucson, Arizona.
Patients Out of Time.
Patients Out of Time. All the top cannabinoid researchers are going to be speaking there. If you can find time, if you're really dedicated to knowing the science and working as an activist with the science, this is the place to be. Tucson, Patients Out of Time. Check it out. And if you can come, please come. You'll get saturated in cannabis science.
And who doesn't like to be saturated in cannabis? Once again,
Here.
Clint Werner, Paul Stanford, Deborah Small, Chris Conrad. We're going to take a quick break up here on the main stage, maybe play some music or something. Debbie Goldsberry and a bunch of other people will be up here at 3 o'clock.